Welcome to the Equipping You in Grace podcast, hosted by Dave Jenkins. The Equipping You in Grace podcast is a podcast about helping Christians develop a biblical worldview in a conversational tone about issues inside and outside the church. Now, for today's episode, let's join our host, Dave Jenkins.
All right, everybody, welcome back to the Equipping You in Grace podcast. My name is Dave, and I'm the host for this show. And with us today is our friend Jenn Chenn. Jenn, welcome to the Equipping You in Grace podcast, sister.
Oh, thank you so much for having me on. I'm excited about this ministry.
Thank you so much. Can you please tell us a little bit about yourself, your life, marriage, ministry, and what ministry projects that you're working on?
Briefly, I am married. Actually, next month it will be 28 years to my husband, best friend, Peter. We just launched our only son, Garrett, to college this fall. And so it's kind of been this mix of joy, loss, gain, because it's changed our relationship with him. But it's actually been in really good ways, and it's neat to see his fledgling faith go off on within his now campus community. And so that's been a joy. Just a little background of myself. I was trained as an integrative, both marriage and family counselor, and then a clinical psychologist, and worked in the field for a while, and then received biblical counseling, and then got back my master's in biblical counseling and left secular world entirely. And so that's my background. As far as current ministry, I am teaching right now at the Master's University. I'm doing their Introduction to Psych course, but actually doing it from a biblical counseling perspective. So that's really cool, and I love it. And it's really cool because most of the lectures kind of end with a gospel message of they're saying this is what truth is and this is the answer, but we have the gospel. So that's a lot of fun. I love it. And then where my heart has also been really recently is with Japan, that I have an opportunity last November to speak to. There was a conference, the first ever Asia Pacific Biblical Counseling Conference. And Japan is a country where less than 2%, it's likely more than 0.5% is Christian. It's really tough ground. But biblical counseling seems to be taking off as a ministry there, and it's really exciting. And I'm actually headed back there next month to do a biblical counseling training in Osaka. So, and I'm doing that with biblical counseling ministries worldwide. So that's what ministry is looking like these days.
Oh, wonderful. That's Andrew Rogers, right?
Yes.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. Yeah. I've chatted with him over Facebook. I haven't had the privilege of meeting him, but,
you need to interview him.
Yeah, I should, right? I should. There's so many people to talk with. So, congratulations on, you guys' wedding anniversary there, and, becoming empty nesters, and, all the ways that the Lord is using you. That's really wonderful to hear. So.
Yes.
Well, can you tell us about this, book, or I just call it a book, but it's, booklet, whatever you want to call it. It's called Biblical Counseling and Mental Disorder Diagnosis. Can you tell us why you wrote it, please, and how you hope it'll be received?
Yes. Dr. Ernie Baker is a friend of mine and has mentored me. And we kind of talked over the years about diagnosis, and I would share with him some of my experiences of diagnosing and dealing with it. And he's like, you need to write a book one day, Jen. I was like, yeah, sure. Well, he approached me about 2.5 years ago and said, I'm doing this series on critical issues in biblical counseling, and I would love for you to write this book on the DSM. And I was like, I don't know if I'm a writer. I don't know this, that. But here we are, over 2 years later, and finally got a published copy of it. So you asked, why did I write it? So I've kind of been watching the biblical counseling world, and I am not a person that wants to even be totally vocal because it's not my personality, but what I am seeing in the biblical counseling world is sometimes a very complete misunderstanding of what a mental disorder diagnosis is, and sometimes even an embracing of the DSM. And so I think I wanted to help people to understand what it really is. What is the DSM, which we'll talk about, and what it does and doesn't do, and why the Bible is superior, and why we don't need to be clinically informed to be able to provide adequate care for our counselees. But I hope that it would be received as really people to get truth about really what is the DSM and what it's not, and why it is weak, and why we can be equipped to counsel.
Very good, very good. So for those unfamiliar with the DSM, maybe tell us what that word means and why they should care about it, you know?
Yes. So this is the DSM. It's actually pretty hefty, maybe 4 pounds. And in it are almost 300 mental disorder diagnoses. This is what's used by the mental health field. And in it has those 300 labels. And notice, actually, I'm using the word label because with the diagnoses, you tend to think it's something there's labs or brain scans or some sort of thing that, you know, in the medical field, they'll tend to diagnose with based on medical labs and symptoms. I mean, not 100%, but in general. But for mental health, the disorders are based on, they have decided that, oh, these group of symptoms go together and we're going to label it depression, or these sort of symptoms go together and we're going to label it anxiety, or we're going to label it ADHD, or all the different labels, but it's not the same process as the medical field. And I think that they can start to be equated with a medical diagnosis, which then becomes, oh, wait, we're not medical doctors, so we're not equipped to handle people who have a mental disorder diagnosis.
Yeah, you talk about mental health versus mental illness in the book. Do you want to can you help us understand that? Because I know there's a lot to that explanation, but also I know that there's a lot of confusion. Like, should Christians be concerned with, say, their elderly parent, like my elderly parents, have a diagnosis of dementia? How do we think about that? I know that kind of probably touches on some things in your book, right?
Yes, definitely. That's kind of what makes it even more complicated, is because there are some labels in here that are true illnesses or diseases where there is a pathology and you can see it in the brain and it's measurable and it's diagnosable through medical means, something like dementia. But the majority of the book is not like that. But yet we hear the term mental illness, and illness connotates that there's some sort of disease process, versus a disorder. Yes, there's something wrong, but illness almost starts to take it into this medical realm. And again, there are certain things in here that are more medical in nature, like dementia, like traumatic brain injury, but then there's a lot of it that is not. And yet people will say, oh, I have this mental illness, which makes them think that somehow now their brain is sick in some way.
And I think a lot of people get confused theologically as we process this. I know we're going to talk about this in a minute or in a little bit, but and God gives us common grace. So what we're talking about with DSM is we're talking about God's common grace wisdom that he's given to people because, they've studied the brain, right? Use the brain. They've studied human behavior like yourself. And so they understand that, but what we're saying, I think, and what you're going to try to communicate to our audience is that we first and foremost submit to God's authoritative, sufficient, word, over and against submitting to something first and foremost and primarily to the DSM.
Yes.
We can learn. So what I'm saying is, so that nobody misunderstands me, and please correct me if I'm wrong. We can learn from the DSM, but we have to submit to the Bible. So everything that we read in the DSM has to be filtered through Scripture. Would that be a fair assessment from a biblical counseling perspective?
I would say even more so to be aware that we have to be careful about the assumptions that we might make about the DSM versus what it truly is. And that one of the things that it is, it's an attempt to communicate about these different label groups of symptoms in the hopes of eventually better identifying disorders, being able to better identify the causes and develop treatment. But this book is merely a summary of signs and symptoms that they put together. But it's not a biomedical model of some sort of mental illness. It is merely like a framework of, okay, this is kind of where it falls around, versus this is a discrete thing that we can define as a biomedical illness, and therefore it's different than what you would get in the medical field. And so it's merely more of a kind of general guide versus a definitive, these are truly biomedical illnesses. Does that make sense?
That makes sense, especially because you're saying that this is a framework to help guide people to understand what that mental health illness is, so they have some sort of like accepted guidelines. Like, when you're writing an academic paper in Bible college or seminary, I don't know outside of Bible college or seminary, you have usually most Bible colleges and seminaries use Turabian. And so Turabian, is a accepted academic standard. And of course, in academia, there's acceptable ways of making arguments, i.e. you have to support your argument with facts, especially if you're arguing against somebody's position. You have to substantiate the argument. And so I think, and to draw that to your point, the DSM is just a guidebook, a framework, like you said, kind of like the Turabian is, to help people understand, hey, this is how you write. Okay, well, this is how you diagnose a mental health illness. Is that a fair comparison? I mean, it's not like maybe 1-to-1, of course. They're different things,
it's
but
a good loose metaphor.
Yeah.
Right. And then, but here's where the metaphor falls apart, is that the Turabian is trying to just organize information. And not that the DSM isn't. And I mean, there are people that care and are trying to figure out how to communicate with each other and say, are we talking about the same thing? But the human heart is so complicated. But with this quote science of people can also take the DSM as scientific. And what I talk about in the book is a lot of kind of breaking down how it doesn't fit science. Let me mention a couple of things. Well, first of all, that there's a lot of inconsistency in the labels, where one symptom can be a part of depression, but it can also be part of anxiety, and it could be also part of PTSD. And so there's a big overlap of symptoms with all these different labels. So there's that problem. Another problem is reliability. And all that means is, if I go to this doctor, will they all give me the same diagnosis? And I'm not saying like, sometimes we'll go to primary care and then they send us to a specialist. But what happens, and what I even found is, so I was a psychologist, I would give somebody one diagnosis. The psychiatrist would see them and give them a totally different diagnosis. And then I would have them sent for formal psychological testing, and that person would give them a different diagnosis. So that's one thing. And then across the board, I could see all the different clinics that they've been to and the diagnoses. And a lot of times there were a lot of inconsistencies in them. So there wasn't a consistency in diagnoses with different people giving them. And there's many reasons for that. But part of it is, first of all, with the labels themselves, but then second of all, with the people who are actually doing the diagnosis. So that's two things. The third thing I'm thinking about really is there is like a really socio-political part of the DSM and its development. And this last version, we're on version 5, there was actually 70% of people that served on the DSM committees to define these labels had financial ties to the pharmaceutical companies. So these are not unbiased people. You know, these are people getting money for research, etc. Yeah, that's its whole crazy thing. We could probably do a whole podcast just on that. And with the DSM-5, the secular experts were so concerned that these current labels in the DSM are not helpful that they turned, there's something called the National Institute of Mental Health. They are the biggest researchers in the US, have the most monies, etc. They actually reoriented away from the DSM because they did not feel like these labels were appropriate for research. And so with all of that, it's from a scientific point of view that this DSM does not hold up well. And actually, let me read you something that Dr. Thomas Insel, he is actually a psychiatrist, a neuroscientist, and he used to be the director of the National Institute of Mental Health. He said, while the DSM has been described as a Bible for the field, it is at best a dictionary, creating a set of labels and defining each. But then he stated, as long as the research community takes the DSM to be a Bible, we'll never make progress. That will never make progress. People think everything has to match DSM criteria, but you know what? Biology never read that book, right? So he's really saying that these labels are not helpful to do further research, and we need to scrap it and move on to something else. Now, on the other side of the world, there's the National Health Service, and they're like the hugest both public health, medical and mental health providers in Europe. And same thing in terms of funding. It's the world's largest publicly funded health service. And they wrote, rather than seeing the DSM-5 as the psychiatric Bible, it may be better to think of it as a rudimentary travel guide to a land we have barely begun to explore. So we cannot take the DSM as something that is reliable and that is correctly even describing what people have. And please don't hear me saying that people aren't suffering, that people are definitely having things. I'm not saying that, quote, mental illness is not real, people's experience is not real. What I am saying is the way that man's best attempts at labeling it is falling very short.
You know, this kind of brings, your last sentence there kind of brings me to a question, because we've been talking about suffering for a while now as a topic, because people, you know, who doesn't experience suffering, and you know, because of the fall, and then, you know, because we're not yet to heaven. So, you know, we're waiting that day for eternity. So we're on this side of eternity. So how does this like topic, how should Christians think about that in light of facing suffering? And you can use my parents' memory issues. A lot of people now have memory issues. I don't mind you using somebody like my dad, who has dementia, and my mom has advanced dementia. How does a topic like that, this DSM, and of course the biblical category of suffering, how should we think about that for those that are experiencing those types of issues?
Right. And the thing is, if your dad went to a neurologist, you know, they would get the same diagnosis. That is very clear. It's medical. There's documentation of the progression of it, etc. But your question, how do we help people? And I think that's what we discussed with the fallen condition focus, and you mentioning, we're in this post-Genesis 3 world, or before Christ's second coming. We are, in Romans 8, it talks about, we're groaning because the creation is being subjected to what seems like futility, right? And, as a psychologist, I thought, I was actually told in my studies that, the Bible is for our salvation and for eternity, but psychology is going to help us with now. But in the book, I talk about Brian Chappell's fallen condition focus, and he talks about how each passage and text in the Bible meets one of 4 conditions, that all of us are fallen and all of us need God's and grace and mercy for 4 different reasons. And the first one is fallenness, and it's due to our sin. And there's so many texts that talk about how do we find God's grace and mercy in the midst of sin. And then we're finite, that we as humans have limits of our knowledge. We're not omniscient like God. We have limits in our understanding. Like, as he just said, they've only barely begun to explore kind of the human mind. Neuroscience is 50 years old, barely. So it's in its infancy, and it's just so much about the brain, and then they'll believe this, and then they'll go, no. And then there's so many things that we do not understand. Or there's things that we don't understand about God, that he is so infinite that I feel like I'm always learning something new about him. Our emotional capacity, we have certain bandwidths. And then you were just talking about, I was just thinking because of their age. There's their mental ability because of the dementia, but then assumption of just being older, that more and more, our bodies are decaying. And that's the reality of the fallen world. And there's so many passages to address when we're in that place. There's nothing in the Bible that talks about dementia per se, but that doesn't mean, now the Bible doesn't apply, because there's so much about our finiteness. Then there's the faltering, that there's times where we'll waver in our faith, especially when we see the gap between who we are told that God is, or who we read who he is to be, and then our experience in this fallen world. And then our faith starts to waver. And I just think about Jerry Bridges and trusting God, and how much that's helped me in my wavering faith, and faltering faith. And then just our fragility, that there's times when we're wounded and weak, that I just think about Elijah after he fought off the prophets of Baal, and he was just exhausted, But with all of these, when we're able to categorize the people in these ways versus the DSM, then we have biblical answers, we have biblical hope, we have biblical help.
Jenn, that is so good. Because what you did is you helped us understand, hey, we live in this fallen world. People's problems are really real.
Yes.
They're not pretend. They're not make believe. We're not saying that they don't exist, because as Christians, we believe in reality. We have reality because God defines reality, and because God defines truth, we can have, the existence of reality itself, not a pretend to make believe, thing. And so I think what you said is absolutely, 100% helpful, because, those things are traumatic. They're hurtful. They're real. You can't minimize anybody's pain or suffering. And more importantly, God doesn't minimize our pain and suffering. You look at the book of Psalms, you see very real pain and suffering. You look at, 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel, you look at the books of, how can you read, 1 Kings, 2 Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles? How can you read the prophets? How can you read, the Gospels or the epistles, and not see pain and suffering and people really facing it. And of course, then by extension, our own lives, right? We look at our own lives, with people who have, like my parents, dementia and memory issues and, getting cancer. And, we don't minimize those things, and John 14, Jesus says he goes to prepare a place for us. In John 16:33, 2 chapters later, or a chapter and a half later, he says, in this world, you're going to have tribulation. So, you're going to have pain. You're going to have suffering. Of course, that's about persecution, but it's also can be applied to our pain, our hurt, our suffering. James tells us in James 1:2-3 to consider it pure joy, brothers, when you face suffering, knowing that the testing of your faith produces patience and endurance, and patience is a fruit of the Spirit, according to Paul in Galatians 5. So, there's a lot to unpack from, what you just said. So I think, yeah. Any thoughts on that before we move on to that?
No, and as you're speaking too, I was thinking about the Apostle Paul himself, beating, stoning, shipwrecks, in prison. And yet he writes, but we don't lose heart, though our outer self is wasting away, which he acknowledges, it's decaying, that our inner self can be renewed day by day. And so the Bible is about today and reality and suffering, and that it's easy to, I think the beauty, or I don't know the beauty, the right word, the lure of these mental health labels is it seems like, oh my gosh, somebody put a word or gave me a label that makes sense to my suffering. They must know how to help me, right? And then I go to the answers that go with that label rather than to biblical help and hope.
So we're kind of touching on this question, but how do we minister to people who have a medical component to their problems?
Right. That is definitely, Paul recognizes this outer man, and we are to be good stewards of our outer man, which is a temple of the Holy Spirit. And so I am going to make sure that they are stewarding that. I'm not going to be like my 100% focus. I'm going to check in. I'm going to make sure if they have medical condition that they're doing things to care for it. And if not, why? Because that's, again, poor stewardship. But if they're not, it has something to do with their biblical heart, like what's going on with their desires. And we do know that it's that fallenness and weakness. And we don't know in 2 Corinthians 12 that Paul's thorn, some people have said it's physical, other people have said it's people, but regardless, and the back to the fallen condition focus is like, how do we know God's grace is sufficient in our weakness? And so pointing them to the hope, the struggle is real, the hope is real. Sometimes the faltering might be real. And yet, even though my heart and flesh may fail, the Lord is my portion forever.
Yeah, I love that you brought up 2 Corinthians 12 because, there he's talking about, like you said, his weakness. He found contentment, in the Lord. He learned contentment. He learned the sufficiency of Christ in, all things. And, one thing that one of my friends, local friends here in the Oregon area, he says is, what is the Lord teaching me through this? Because he wants to lean in. He wants to acknowledge, what is the Lord teaching me? And I think if we were to all ask that question a little bit more, we would lean in like Paul did, in 2 Corinthians 12 and realize, hey, this is what God's teaching me through this. And well, what is that going to do? It's going to produce more of the fruits of the Spirit. But above all, it's going to help us to continue to humble ourselves before God, recognizing that, all things are held together by his capable hands, and he's orchestrating all history, according to his plan, according to his purpose, including our own. And nothing in our lives is outside of his gaze. And so we can lean into that question, what is God teaching me, and realize this is a good thing. I can face my suffering. I can even prepare for suffering, with God's help, with God's word, with God's spirit, with, God's people within the church. And, I can get help, like we're talking about, and evaluate it in light of God's word, and with resources like what you're written in this book. And, that doesn't minimize, like, to your earlier point, though, that there are concerns about this whole DSM. And I didn't actually ask you this question. We've kind of, to be clear, what is the main difference or differences? You write not only about the DSM in this book, but the ICD. So what are the differences between the DSM and the ICD? And are there any similarities between the two? Maybe what are some distinguishing marks of those, in case, people they're confused about that, or maybe they've heard of it, but they don't know?
Yes, definitely. So the DSM was developed by the American Psychiatric Association. So it's here in the US. And then it's, as I talked about, highly influenced by the pharmaceutical companies, as well as a lot of the people are professors. So it's influenced by the US educational system. And then, of course, US politics. Actually, homosexuality was in the DSM-3. And because of a vote, they took it out of the DSM-4. And then, so that's just kind of the political, economic background, and then who wrote it. And then the DSM just uses something called an operational criteria approach. And that's just operationalized. That's just a big word for, how do I turn this big abstract concept like depression into something that I can measure and define? So how do I operationalize the word depression so that we all know we're talking about the same thing if we use the term depression? And with the DSM, they have very specific and detailed descriptions of the symptoms and the behaviors that have to be present if you get a diagnosis. So that's the DSM. Now on the ICD, that just stands for the International Classification of Diseases. And that's published by the World Health Organization. That book actually is used globally, but it's mostly for medical diseases. That there's only one chapter that has mental disorders in it. And the way it works is, instead of operationalize and they have to have this many of this criteria and this many of that criteria, they just use something called a prototype model. And then it's like, this is what a typical case of depression looks like. And if it's something close to that, then we can slap you with that diagnosis, sort of thing. But that is, they actually have come together, that the ICD takes a lot of the ideas from the DSM. And then the codes that are in the DSM are actually part of the ICD. Because part of what the World Health Organization does is epidemiology. And so they want to measure all over the world where different diseases and illnesses are. And then the other thing they do with the ICD codes is medical billing. And so that's just another side note of, if you see a mental health professional, in order to keep seeing you, they have to give you a diagnosis in order to bill, whether your insurance or anybody else. So it's basically required to have a diagnosis in order to keep seeing a mental health professional.
And Jenn, I really, what you said is really, really important, but I don't want anybody we don't want to lack compassion. And of course we want providers, medical professionals who, spend all those years like yourself, to get paid for the work that they do, and we as Christians, we believe in hard work. And so I'm not putting words in your mouth, but I don't want anybody to misunderstand that we're not against people getting paid for, their hard work or anything. And I know you're not saying that because you were just explaining something, but I don't want listeners or those who watch to get the wrong idea that, hey, we're concerned about that, rightly so, but we still want those people to get paid because they're doing
Yes.
a service and they have the knowledge and the education. And this is where these matters, as we've already said, they get a little dicey, right? We want people to get paid for the work they do, but a lot of the things that have been done behind these things you're saying are concerning, and these are things where you have to work through them, and you have to have the right categories of sin. We're sinners by nature and by choice. We don't have to, so you don't have to teach a child to sin. Just because somebody has a medical degree, that doesn't mean that they're going to act ethically. They have ethical standards, right? They have moral standards that they have to adhere to. Forgive me if I'm going to pronounce this wrong. The Hippocratic Oath. Do no harm, right? So that there's professional standards and there's professional associations, and on and on it goes, right? And the same is true with even biblical counselors and pastors and ministry leaders and writers and podcasters. If you don't adhere to a certain standard, guess what? And people find out, guess what? They're gonna tune you out. They're gonna delete your throw away your book, and you're gonna be considered not a trustworthy source of information, right? So anything stand out that you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, and they do follow these have these oaths and these ethics and these legal pathways that and accreditations and licensures and all of that. And yet sometimes it gets down to the pragmatic, So if I give somebody, say somebody's coming to me with health insurance, and if I give them an adjustment disorder, maybe they'll get like 4 sessions, right? But if I give them major depressive disorder severe, then maybe I'll get 25 sessions. And so if I really want to help somebody, do I really think I can help them with 4 sessions? But I can give them a more severe diagnosis, so I can see them longer and give them the help that I think that they need. Does that make sense? Where you could play with somebody's diagnosis, not as a means to harm them, but to help them. And yet at the same time, it adds a weird dynamic. And then what's in their medical record now is major depression, severe,
So my dad actually had a diagnosis from a neurologist in Seattle at a hospital of dementia. But then when he went to the military hospital, and this kind of relates to your point, they said he had some neurological disorder, which, I mean, obviously dementia is a neurological disorder, but they said that he just had a neurological disorder and wouldn't define that. Well, the practical outworking of that is, we wanted to get him into a memory care facility, but in the state of Washington, if you don't have a diagnosis of dementia or something like that, or you just have a neurological disorder, you can't get in there. So this is kind of where this whole DSM thing collapses on itself, and it just falls flat because you have doctors who, to your point, they interpret the data according to professional standards, right? But then there's not, I don't know if it's not fair to say there's not clear-cut definitions, because there undoubtedly is. I don't know, because that's out. I'm a theologian, so I don't I don't go there. But I'm just saying, it doesn't make sense that here you have a doctor, right, giving my dad a diagnosis at one of the best hospitals in the whole Seattle area, and then at Madigan Hospital in Fort Lewis, he gets another diagnosis, and then they have to go with that diagnosis and can't get him into a memory care facility. And I think that's where something like the DSM really fails to serve people, especially people who need the kind of care that a memory facility can provide over and against a group home that he's been in now for many years. So I don't know. You can tell me if we should delete that, or if you think that's useful.
No, I mean, it is useful of understanding that even medical labels, but DSM even more, that it's sometimes not clear cut. And then when we use that to define somebody, that becomes a problem. The word diagnosis actually comes from dia is through, and then gnosis, biblically gnosis is to know somebody intimately. And so somehow we're supposed to know through a diagnosis somebody intimately, but really actually what it sometimes does is obscure things or focus on one thing and miss all the rest, or it just distorts the whole picture entirely. And so when people get these labels sometimes, then they label it as a mental illness, and then they go with what the secular world has to say for help, when truly there are biblical answers for the majority of things. And even with dementia, it's a medical, we still can learn from the word how to minister to people in it, but then we also need to help them get adequate medical care.
So, Jenn, how does the biblical counselor provide help and hope to those given mental diagnoses?
I think it's like Jesus of entering their world and using that as an entry point of, okay, so you have this diagnosis, but tell me what you experienced, because that's and then from there, and that's what I loved about my biblical counselor, was he wasn't like, no, that's the secular world, let's throw that out. Instead, he was just like, here, let's open up the Bible together and let's see how the Bible addresses the things that you're experiencing. And let's see who God is in the midst of your experiencing those things. Let's see what God has done, is doing, will do. And it just changed everything. Just how I saw people's problems, my own problems. You talked about the suffering, getting a really solid theology of suffering, but most of all, having that relationship with God and that learning and growing in knowledge of Him.
Yeah, that's really good. Because like we've both said, life hurts. I mean, it's painful, and like one of the things since I do talk about my parents, one of the things I get a lot is everybody's situation is different with a memory loss and pain, and just because I've experienced something, it's different. Even with my dad is a very introverted person, and my mom is more extroverted. Their personalities obviously are very different. Even though they were married for 30 plus years and then they divorced, they're two totally different people, and they've been apart for a long time. So they have different, their lives have diverged from each other. And so they have different, life experience and all those things. And that's true for all of these situations. And so one of my things that I talk about a lot is that there's a lot of people, I think, not necessarily biblical counselors, but I think we can even do this in biblical counseling when people come before us. Hey, I know the answer to that question. And it's good to know answers. I'm not saying that we shouldn't have good theology or good practice, but we should be careful to not have a cookie cutter approach, like one size fits all, right?
Amen. Jesus talked to each person so individually.
Yeah. Do you want to touch on that a bit?
I'm just totally just emphasizing what you say, and I think that's what can happen with a diagnosis of, this person coming to me for counseling with depression. Now I'm going to pull out this passage and that passage, and this is the protocol I'm going to follow. And one of my counselors, counseling supervisors told me, you've met one person with depression, that means you've met one person with depression, and same thing, like you're saying, dementia, they have that same diagnosis, but it presents so differently in so many different people.
Yeah. And I mean, who hasn't struggled with anxiety or fear or doubt? And just because you struggle with anxiety, to extend this out, doesn't mean that that person that's experiencing that anxiety in that moment because of a number of factors, financial, marital, whatever. It doesn't mean that your experience is similar to theirs. Now, similar feelings, similar emotion, different experience. And so, yeah. Any thoughts on that? And we were kind of taking this and expanding it because, it's not just like, not everybody has a memory, but who hasn't struggled with anxiety and discouragement and depression and doubt?
Right.
And
that's totally one of the critiques of the DSM is that it's now turned normal human experience into this like mental illness or this disorder when it is us dealing with a disordered world and our disordered selves. And yeah, it just is unclear of, what is human experience versus this is now a disorder in terms of medically, mentally.
Yeah, that's really good, Jenn. Well, can you tell our listeners and those who watch where they can find out more about you and your ministry, and of course, where they can pick up the book? And then I have one other question as we wrap up today.
Yes. So I am honestly not a big public ministry person, so I'm not having anything with that. As far as the book, though, it is on Shepherd's Press website. It's supposed to be on Amazon, and I see it there, but you can't order it as of today. But they were saying as of the launch date, it should be available, but it's definitely on Shepherd's Press website.
Well, we'll definitely link to Shepherd's Press so they get the publicity and people can pick it up there. So as we wrap up today's episode, can you give us a few takeaways, Jenn?
Yes, that most of all, if you have a diagnosis from the DSM or somebody you're counseling or somebody in your flock, don't feel like now I need to go farm them off to get professional help. That there are biblical counselors and even just people who aren't biblical counselors, but very mature in their faith and mature in their word, that have the capability to minister to people with these labels. And second of all, know that these labels have lots of problems. They lack scientific validity, reliability, and just there's a lot of problems with them. And, that we have so much more to offer than what the secular world does, that they can put some Band-Aids on some of the problems or maybe change a little behavior, change a little thoughts, but we get to give them Christ and true transformation from the heart. Well, we get to point them to that. Obviously, it's only Christ that does that and the Spirit, but that's what we get to minister.
That's really good, Jenn. Really good. Well, this has been a really good conversation. I think it's not only clarifying, like the book, but will be helpful and minister to people. And I think that's really important. So guys, I want to encourage you, as always, pick up this book, Biblical Counseling and Mental Order Diagnosis, by Jenn. It's really good. It's really easy to understand. She breaks things down. She explains them. She takes you to God's word. She takes you to the good theology that the church has. And most importantly, she is focusing on how biblical counseling how biblical counselors should think from God's word about the DSM. And I think that's really, really vital today in this time of great challenges with mental health. So thank you guys for listening and watching. Jenn, thank you so much for joining us on today's episode.
Thank you, Dave.
Thank you for listening to the Equipping You in Grace podcast. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe, rate us on the app, and share this with your friends and family on social media. If you want to find us on social media, you can find us on Twitter @Servants of Grace, on Instagram @Servants of Grace, or by searching at Servants of Grace on Facebook. You can also find this episode and many others like it on the front page of our website, servantsofgrace.org.